Okay, we will start now. Last week we talked about the learning and memory, and I also have posed the second assignment. Okay, so the deadline I cannot remember is December, some early December. Okay, you have time to work on that one. Just the same, you watch the video and then submit a one-page summary. Okay, so today we are going to talk about some of the pathogenic mechanism of neurological disorders. So we are not going to go very deep, but just to give you some idea. So what happens when some of the circuitry or the neurotransmitter or neurochemistry is having problem in the nervous system. So it's like more like, you know, we have learned about the basic connections, the anatomy, the cell biology, and then we've been to talk about different neurochemistry of the neurotransmitters. Then last time, then we talk about the how those can go together, and then getting the foundation of the learning and memory and cognitive functions. Then we'll talk about some of the disease mechanism and see what happens if some of the system actually is not functioning properly. Some of the disorder that include the one that we will talk about today, schizophrenia, and then mood disorder. Alzheimer's disease, we will also talk about it in more detail later. And then if we still have time, then we will cover the Parkinson's disease as well. We will also talk about some of the mechanism behind the stroke, how the neurons will die, the mechanism. There are actually a lot of different diseases. For example, Huntington's disease, we are not going to talk about it, but this is something that, you know, inherited. You know, if people get the gene, then they will have it. The interesting one that, well, I mentioned sometime, but we also will not cover it, is called the chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which happens in some of the athletes if they have concussion all the time. Particular, maybe you are not aware of that, is the American football players. They actually, a lot of them actually suffer from those. Okay. So let's start with the so-called the schizophrenia. Schizophrenia actually is not uncommon, as also in Hong Kong actually there are a lot of cases, scary cases in which that those patients, if they're not controlling their symptoms, then that will be a problem. Particularly in Hong Kong, actually, is a very dense area, and some of the contributor may be stress, you know, but a lot of those actually we still do not know the reason behind that. Okay, so it is a chronic, severe chronic disabling mental disorders. So it's not like a come and go. It usually develop at the youngest age, teenagers, and then that will go on until depends on the onset. You know, so it affects around 1% of the population with the onset in the late adolescence. So it's, you know, in late teens and, you know, maybe possible early 20s. Now, the disease actually less than 30% of those affected individuals experience complete remission. So it's a disease that actually is very difficult to completely cure. Okay. It's a brain disorder with a high degree of heritability. But so far, there has no single genetic mutation has been linked to it because it's most likely is a very complex, many loci involved. So actually, some of those diseases or mentally affected, they are believed to not be due to a single mutations. Okay, but we know that this is a heritability. So because if the family has history of patients suffering from schizophrenia, that's most likely that will pass on. Okay, now this is a very difficult idea. Same for depressions actually. Why, if there's a family history, we still cannot 100% sure that it's related to genetics. So another factors that contribute is actually, can you think of anything? Environment, yes. What type of environment? Huh? Yes, the upbringing, very good. So if the parents actually suffer from it, that means that the kids most likely will be affected in certain ways. So that will be a environmental factors. Epigenetics will be a interesting stuff. We don't know actually. Which is good, actually, about epigenetics. More and more mental or neural function actually is related to epigenetics. So it's related to how the genome is being modified. Yeah, so it's a very hot topics. Yeah, okay, very good. Okay. So what are the symptoms of the schizophrenia? Including, for example, hallucinations, which is auditorial voices commenting on their thoughts or actions, or somebody talking. So it's always a voice that talking to the patients. Delusions in paranoid nature, feeling being prosecuted, or the body is being controlled by someone else. Disorganized cognitive process, illogical reasoning. So it's not logical. There's no logical thinking. Now, some of the negative symptoms, including the social incompetence. So no social interactions, disruption in problem-solving abilities. So because it's not logical, how can they solve problems? Sometimes impaired verbal fluency as well. Now, I always talk about, so how can they will have hallucinations or being controlled? Now, I always talk about, I mean, everyone talk to themselves in somehow. But you know that you are talking to yourself. Or when you touch yourself, you know that you're touching yourself because we know that, we can distinguish. But what happens if the circuitry is being affected, and then that kind of, self-awareness actually being affected. So that's how the circuitry is being affected, and then that may give you the symptoms. And that actually has the evidence coming from, for example, some people abuse drugs, for example, ketamine and so on. I gave an example already. Actually, there's a news in Hong Kong that what do you mean by haunted? So it depends on whether you believe that there's a bad, evil spirit, but most of the cases, those are actually schizophrenia. Oh, it's not a something happens. So a lot of people, they will go to religious. Well, in the early days, when the science is not that well studied, but there are cases actually. If you ask me, I don't know. It's still, some people will. What is it called? It's called the. I don't know. I cannot remember what those are. There's a movie that was that.
I just have a question.
Yes.
Yes. So what's the difference of hallucinations and like multiple personalities in the body? Some people have many personalities and they're talking to themselves, and it's actually a thing.
No, they don't have two personalities. They just heard a voice that's from another people telling them to do something, but that person is not themselves. The hallucination.
Yeah, that hallucination is not that. Yeah, so it's like somebody talking to them. So you heard about it. Somebody asked me to kill somebody, something like that. You know, those are typical schizophrenic. So one of the online student asked identity. No, what's that movie? Exodus. Is it Exodus? No. Well, anyway, so it depends on people. Some you know, well, I mean, in the world there are a lot of times that you cannot explain. You know, whether you believe in God or believe in bad evil spirit, but in the case of schizophrenia, there are drugs that can actually relieve the symptoms. Okay, so that means that actually that is related to the dysfunction of the nervous system. So we believe. Now, the treatment of this schizophrenia usually, actually, as we mentioned, is those antipsychotic drugs actually include, they are mostly dopamine antagonists. So, for example, chlorpromazine and then haloperidol, those are actually dopamine antagonists. So reduce the dopaminergic or catecholamine function. However, if you reduce it, there will be side effect like so-called the Parkinson's disease-like effect, because that if you suppress it, other function will be also affected. So as we mentioned about the movie A Beautiful Mind, that's the problem. So there's a side effect of those. Now, if that is not very responsive to those dopamine antagonists, then there will be other drugs. Clozapine actually is another one, but the function is less clear actually. It may bind to affect the catecholamine or serotonergic system. Okay, so those are, if this is not effective for the responsive for those dopamine antagonists, then they will try this class of drugs. So as you can see that there are not much that you can do. The schizophrenia, the study of schizophrenia is still actually quite lacking behind. Apart from genetic screening, it is very difficult to study because that there are no animal models of schizophrenia. Okay, so it's just there's no schizophrenic rodents, for example. So that's the reason why it is kind of difficult to study. So all you can do is actually look at the patients. Okay. Now, for example, in the MRI imaging to see actually whether there's any structural changes or neurochemical features in those schizophrenic patients. Now, in some of the cases, actually, there seems to be reduction of the brain volume, but those are also very difficult because in terms of human, we have variability. Not everyone is two individuals are exactly the same. Now, even for twins, so twins genetically they are the same, but how they are growing up or their environment still might be different. Okay. Yes.
So, is it that the animals just simply biologically will not have this disease, or it's just they might have, but we cannot find a way to know it?
It's just that you cannot. How can you tell that they are schizophrenic?
You can just ask them, are you okay?
No. Yeah.
So they might have it. It's just we don't know.
Yeah, just we don't know. But I think they might have those conditions as well. I mean, it is possible. It's not that you cannot find one but you cannot get one that you can exactly tell, because the symptoms is is in your mind. So how can you study that? You cannot do a scanning, for example, physical scan can tell whether one is schizophrenic or not. Okay, so even in human, you cannot do that. It's just that how the person expressed to you. That, for example, a person is saying that someone is talking to me, just like the same. Do you believe in ghosts? A little bit, but you cannot prove it. Nobody can prove whether there's a ghost or not, even though they are saying that they can see things and well, maybe they really can see things, but how do you know that only they can see it? Those people with the so-called the sixth sense in English. The eyes can see those, but I mean you really cannot tell. Just like they're always saying that some of the camera actually can get images of those, but there are well known places that are known to be haunted. So whether you dare to stay there, that's another problem. Okay, so anyway, so we go back. So there are cortical limbic abnormalities in the schizophrenia. For example, changes in the prefrontal cortex activities, particularly the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. So that might be hormonal-induced changes as well. We don't know actually. Changes in the dopaminergic activities and the NMDA receptor signaling, particularly NMDA receptor signaling as well, because in those drugs that actually inhibitor, for example, PCP, penicillin, and also ketamine, some of those people abuse those. Actually, they have some schizophrenic symptoms. So actually, there was a scary incidents in which that, not in Hong Kong, I think in US, in which the father actually abused using the PCP. It's called the angel dust. And then he was the hallucination actually so much that actually he beaten his son's eyes out, So those are, symptoms that are similar, okay. Now, so actually there are a lot of systems seems to be affected in all cases, but that is not conclusive. For example, it is highly heritable that we know. Usually family with the history of the schizophrenic actually is more likely to pass it to the future generations. Now, some of the study from the postmodern study, because it's difficult to when the patient is suffering schizophrenia, you will not take a tissue from the brain to analyze it. It's not possible. And even taking the CSF is not quite, because it's not going to help the patients, okay? But there are changes in the dopaminergic markers. For example, the dopamine and also the HGA, the metabolites of it. So that means that, the activity actually is affected. Some of those also find that the D1 receptor in the frontal subcortical region actually increased. Again, those are from limited postmodern samples. Some of those hypofunctions of the NMDA receptors. The receptors associated pathways are also modulated in the schizophrenia. Now, if this is related to NMDA, then also NO signaling might be involved as well. So those, you can see that actually is every different regions. So that's the reason why that, the cause of the disease is still not very clear. So that's the reason why that the study in the schizophrenia are very limited. So it's like for a long time, you know, we still have the same. There's no improved the treatment so far, and just have the same type of treatment. Okay. Okay, that's a little bit about the schizophrenia. The other one we're going to talk about the mood and anxiety disorders. So the anxiety and also the depressions, those are the stress, the mood disorder. Okay. Now we know that actually this is related to the stress. So what is stress? Stress is something unavoidable part of the daily experience. So it's external force that force to deviate from the equilibrium. So that's the most simple way to say it. Now, in order to deal with it, then you have to have a strategy to cope with the stress. Okay. Now, actually, we are also under a lot of stress nowadays to deal with the COVID-19 virus. Actually, I heard about cases that, you know, students are not being affected because that they don't have a student life anymore in the learning process. You know, it's not like before. You can, students can come back and congregate together and share the experience of, you know, university life, you know, going to the canteen, having tea, you know, going to the library, you know, kind of happy, you know. But now it's actually being affected. A lot of students are not, you know, getting used to it. For example, you know, 1 year before, the Zoom program is not known. Actually, I haven't heard about it until last November. And now then we have the Zoom all the time, not just in the class but in meeting. I'm sure that, you know, you guys might need to do Zoom as well to talk about your project, and then the project is going to do it in Zoom. Everything is Zoom. So that's the reason why the Zoom actually stock is like going to the rooftop. You know, if we have to buy some of those stocks, then we are rich. Okay, so that's what Li Ka-shing is so smart. He got some of those stocks. So that's the stress, that experience that you have. So we try to cope with it. So you are more isolated. So maybe we rely on more about, you know, electronics to communicate. Maybe you are FaceTime your friends more or having group meetings, you know, and you know, we cannot eat out that often anymore, you know, no more partying and so on. So we have to cope with it. So that's how we cope with the stress, you know. Now, apart from, you see that there's a mental changes to deal with it, but we also have, you know, the neural system to deal with this kind of stress. Now, the one that actually you may learn about it is the activation of the sympathetic adrenal medullary axis and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So this is actually the different, you know, in the SAMs, that's a fight or flight response. So that's mediated by the adrenaline. So the sympathetic nervous system induce the adrenal gland to secrete the adrenaline, and then that increase your, you know, heart rate and your blood pressure, dilate your bronchi so that you can get more air, and then you can run away or you can get for the fight. So that's one of those. Now, but another one actually is the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So that actually is from the hypothalamus activation. So it's mentally, and then the hypothalamus will activate it, and then secrete the corticotropin releasing factor. Then that go to the pituitary. Then that will and then secrete the adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, and then going to the adrenal cortex, and then that induce the release of glucocorticoids or cortisol. So here you can see that, then that actually will go back, the cortisol will go back to the pituitary and then as a feedback, okay? Now, you still remember glucocorticoids? You know the cortisol? Yes, from the receptor, that's the stress hormone actually, basically. That stress hormone actually have bad effect on your mind. Actually believe that, that actually will make your neurons less branching out, and it's believed that that actually related to the development of the depressive conditions, okay, which is called sometimes called learned helplessness. Okay, so it's in the animal, actually the model for the depression. Animals can be depressed sometimes, which is true actually, in the mouse model. We'll talk a little bit about it. So this is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Okay, so you can see that the adrenal gland kind of involved in the stress. So if you have a enlarged adrenal gland, actually it is not very good for you actually. So to continue, so the mood and anxiety disorders. So anxiety. Now, too anxious may be also a disease symptom as well, actually. So usually it is too anxious and then too much. Then if it is too much, then that will go back to the the other side. So you are supposed in the middle. So equilibrium, but if you are stressed, so that increase your anxiety, then you will be very nervous. Now, it's too much, then we believe that will go to the another side, which is depressed. You are not doing anything, okay? So for example, if you're going for the exam, closing by the exam day, so you are very, very anxious, so you study a lot. However, after studying a lot, you still think that you cannot make it, then you just give up. Oh, never mind, whatever. And then you stop studying, and then you just go there and do the things, and that's it. So that's some of those. Now, anxiety can be, if too much, can be a state of a pathological state. Okay. So, for example, the chief manifestation of the anxiety, the express of complaint. So you go to the doctor and say, I am really, really anxious these days. So you're restless and agitation and tachycardia, sweating, even gastrointestinal disorders. So you're too stressed out. You might have diarrhea, and then you don't sleep well. Those may be some of the problem that require the treatment. Okay, so because that will interfere with the normal productive activities. Okay, so some of those, that's the case. In which that doctors can prescribe, for example, Valium or diazepam. Those are the possible treatments. So that's the reason why that a lot of those again, for example, Michael Jackson's, the time that he was trying to relaunch a show business, and that time he was really nervous, anxious. So that's the reason why that he was taking those diazepam to calm him down. But that's not a good treatment, because if you don't look at the problems of what causing the anxiety, you just have drugs, then that's not going to help at the end. Okay. The other one, actually, another one, the post-traumatic stress disorders, that also happens in people having a traumatic experience. Okay, for example, those people having those people, for example, one good example is that people being sexually assaulted, usually they will have the post-traumatic stress disorders. Those are the very common one, or exposed to big accidents. If you survive the accidents, then you will, suffer from it as well. Other example, more extreme example, people, has been in the war, as I mentioned before. A lot of U.S. soldiers, they been to the Iraq war, particularly the second one. Actually, a lot of them, they suffer from post-traumatic stress disorders. As serious as some of those, actually, they even commit suicide. Okay, so mood disorders actually is something that you need to really take care of. And if you have friends and so on, if they have suffered from anything, then you need to be careful. So that's the depression one. So depression is actually really real. And for some people, for example, Tom Cruise even say that you shouldn't, if you are depressed, you shouldn't take any drugs. But depression is something real, actually, and it is also one of the major reasons that people commit suicide. Okay, so I hope that all of you are happy. Okay, even that now it is everything can solve them. Even though we're closing in, so we are almost done in this class. So we are almost done. So don't be stressed out. So okay. So, and I look at the midterm, oh, actually, you guys are doing pretty well, pretty good. So, okay. We still have the assignment, one more assignment, and project, and then the final as well. Okay. So talking about depression, sometimes people get depressed, or everybody got depressed from time to time, but just like how you deal with it. But depression actually is something affecting a lot of people. As I mentioned before, even in US, such a rich country, there are a lot of people suffering from depressions. As I mentioned about the drugs, the SSRI that have been used to treat those patients, a lot of those has been going into the water system because of, people take a lot of those drugs, and then they excrete it through their urine or so on, and then that actually go into the water system. Okay, so there are two major types of depressions: the major depressive disorders, or unipolar depressions. It's just like the person are really depressed, or the other one is bipolar or manic depressions. So it's characterized by both depressive and manic episodes. So sometimes it's very pumped up, but sometimes it's very depressed. So this is bipolar. Now, in the major depressive disorder, women are actually higher rates of the disorders, twice that of men. So the reason behind is not quite sure, but it is believed that maybe the hormone changes, because for in men, hormone is not going to have a cycle, but women actually they have changes in the hormone that actually may affect their mood. That's also the reason why that after giving birth of their babies, women can suffer from depression. So that is actually very, very important, because that the placenta actually is secreting a lot of hormone, and after it is go out, and then you have to go back to the cycle. So the person actually will have to adjust. That's the reason why that we always talk about the steroid hormone, or the sex hormone, or cortisol actually have effects on your thinking. Okay. But bipolar disorders are actually equally occurred in men and women. Okay. Now, so this is very important. Approximately 60% of all suicide occurred in relation to mood disorder. So this is something that, you have to take care of. If the person is actually depressed, if yourself or your friends or your family members needs to be, you take care of it. You go to see the doctors and see what is the roots of the problem. Okay. Now, another characteristic of the mood disorders actually is recurrent in about 80%. So it can come back. So once that you have it, it can come back. So we'll see that, the reason behind actually, the cause of it may be related to the, actual changes in your circuitry. And then, when the things can touch it again, and then they can have relapse. Now, as I mentioned, both genetic and non-genetic factors actually come in to this development of those. Now, because monozygotic twins have 2 to 3-fold higher concordance for the major depressive disorder than the dizygotic twins. Okay. So if the twins, they have same genetic material, they're more likely to have the development of depressions. Same as that if the family members have history of the depressions, it is also more likely. Now, as I mentioned again, if the parents actually they suffer from depressions, their children will also be affected, because this is also related to the environment as well. It's not just by the genetic materials, and it is the same. There haven't been any single gene linked to the case. So it's also believed to be multi-loci that contribute to the disease. Okay. So what are the symptoms? So depression also have a unique symptoms. So emotional symptoms include the misery, apathy, pessimistic. Another one is no self-esteem, somehow feeling of guilty, inadequate, and feeling ugliness, indecisive, and loss of motivation as well. Now, those are the emotional symptoms. But there are also biological symptoms as well. So retardation of thoughts and actions, loss of sexual drive, sleep disturbance, and loss of appetite. So particularly sleep disturbance, that is one of the also common. So that's the reason why actually in some of the, in some of the countries, not in Hong Kong, so particularly in the northern part of the Europe, or northern part of the America, or southern is actually the less, because somehow, the area or habitable area at the northern part of the earth is actually more. So you know that they have really short daylight time during winter time. So here in Hong Kong, even though we have short daylight, but still sunrise at actually around nowadays, maybe you don't know, I guess you stay at night, right? Sunrise at 6, and then maybe dawn at at 5:30 maybe, yes. But in countries like in Britain, or even more in the northern Sweden, actually they can have the sun will not come as late as 7 or 8, and then it will be dark completely at 4 already. Okay. Now they have a high incidence of those. So one of the ways that they can get away with that nowadays is actually they have sunlight therapy, in which that they can go to a room that actually have bright artificial sunlight, so that to absorb the light exposure, so to improve. Okay. So that's the reason why that we believe that the circadian rhythm actually also contribute to the depressions. Some of the other ones, the symptoms of manic, exceptional enthusiastic and self-confidence, sometimes irritability and aggression as well. Those are all symptoms that actually are related. So I got the link of this, so maybe you can show that.
What do you mean by reductional thought and action?
I
mean, what changes?
Where am I?
How does they change?
So, well, this is actually very difficult. So this is from maybe listen to this one actually. So this one actually I found it in the internet actually. Okay, let's share that with the okay. Huh? Up here. So the online student, can you see it? Okay, good. Let's start. So this one is actually from interview from a patient really suffer from depressions. So he's 22. It's like described as a textbook case of depressive disorders. So he also experienced recurrent depressive episodes. So once it develops, actually is very likely to come back. So let's hear what he.
If you imagine the Colosseum and there's thousands of people in the Colosseum and they're all berating you and just insulting you and hurling abuse at you, and you're stood in the middle of the arena, totally defenseless against this sort of mass crowd. So all those people are sort of myself, and they're all my own thoughts berating yourself. And how do you fight yourself?
So it's like low self-esteem, and then insulting himself. So you see that more than estimate 300 million people suffer from depressions, and so if there are different more than 3 times, then it's more chance to come back. So let's listen to
color drains from your vision completely. It's as though you're wearing sort of monochrome glasses, and mostly the vitality of life sort of drains away in that whatever zest you might have had for a day's activity or whatever may be going on in life, it suddenly vanishes and you don't have that zest anymore.
So, okay. Okay.
I slow down. Even day-to-day movements like, say, showering or washing your hands or getting dressed suddenly becomes very slow and like moving through treacle.
So that's the retardation of the actions. Okay, let's listen. He will talk about this.
So I grew up in very rural Suffolk surroundings. Every country stereotype that you can think of being surrounded by farmers and tractors and not a lot of social life. But when I arrived at university, it was suddenly a very loud, chaotic, very on sort of lifestyle, in that there was always something going on. There was no sort of downtime. I fell into that culture and I was partying a lot. I was drinking a great deal. It just was a horrible coming together of factors that almost conspired against me.
So this is another characteristic of how people develop the depression. So it's sudden changes in the environment or the loss of the loved one or even loss of your pets that can contribute to those. It's so-called life events, okay? Okay.
I would spend all day totally stationary in bed, had no luster for anything, couldn't summon the energy to just do things, to just go to lectures or socialize or anything that I would have normally done. But then the complete contrast to my days were my nights, where I suddenly got a great deal of energy and I would drink a great deal at my university's bars entirely as an isolated enterprise, in the sort of vain hope that it would somehow change my circumstances or change my mood state.
So this is a swinging of the mood. Okay.
One of the key things about the sort of self-laceration that you get into when you're depressed is you compare yourself to what you used to be or to an ideal version of yourself. So I would be sat there in my room surrounded by these books thinking, you used to be able to read this, why can't you do it anymore? You used to be able to shower, why can't you do it anymore? You used to be able to work, why can't you do it anymore? And so on and so on. I was just constantly comparing myself to a previous version of myself.
Okay.
So one night at university, I was at one bar and I thought, I'm going to make a last ditch effort to communicate. I'm going to try and tell people what's going on with me, and I'm going to try and put a name to what's going on. So then suddenly when I tried to express this, my sort of mental state, it suddenly all exploded into a great deal of emotion. And I was crying at the time and sort of being quite loud. I was sort of shouting without realizing I was shouting. And I generally wasn't aware of the environment around me. I suddenly focused entirely on myself and what I needed to say rather than what was going on around me. And it was quite a scene. I woke up and I didn't really know where I was. I had no clue. I was left thinking, okay, am I in some kind of prison or am I jailed in this room? And it suddenly became very apparent that I wasn't allowed to leave, which was infuriating for me. I had never had my sense of movement restricted that much before.
Okay.
One of the things that I held on to so steadfastly, which was this ideal version of masculinity, of not talking about how you feel or not talking about your feelings at all and pulling your socks up, as the saying goes. I realized that that mentality wasn't doing me any favors and was deepening my depression and just making my life worse. No one in life is alone, or they're never as alone as they think they are. There's always a point of contact with the rest of the human race, even if you're not aware of it.
So it's isolations, it's not trying to find help. So it's very typical, actually.
I do have depression still. There's sort of a conception that you go into hospital and then you're cured of depression and then that's it for you. Whereas that's just not true. And I deal with it in a variety of ways. I'm still on medication, which in my experience has helped a great deal with my depression. I exercise a great deal. I run a lot, which helps. And mostly I don't withdraw from the social world. Now I'm much better at dealing with the depression as it develops rather than leaving it until it's sort of crescendoed and done its damage and then dealing with it, because then it's a much larger animal to deal with.
So you can see that actually, another characteristic that actually recurrent. It can happen again. So, and the treatment helps, but still needs to the patient himself needs to deal with it actually at the end. So this is something, you know, very important. So so now then, after you heard about, you know, a patient that described that, so that is actually will help you, you know, what are those symptoms and so on. And this is very important to see this as a very serious illness actually. So whenever I heard about, you know, some so in Hong Kong, even kids, you know, in the primary school, even commit suicide, or even, you know, in university student, you know, those are actually needs to, you know, if you encounter, so need to get help from the people. And then if you see your friends or classmates have some of those, then try to help, okay? Be nice, and particularly nowadays, actually, this wasn't available before. It's like, you know, cyber bullying, you know, in the Facebook and so on. You know, there are cases actually, you know, particularly in teenagers. But obviously, what I heard is nowadays, young people, they don't pay with Facebook anymore. They pay with Instagram. So anyone of you still pay with Facebook? No, no, really no? So face-to-face students say no. How about online student? Maybe not, sometimes. Sometimes I don't understand the value about those, how you post yourself the pictures and what you are doing. And then at the end, being caught, so just like, you know, you know, in the news, the home officing, and post pictures of hiking, supposed to be home officing, and then you post it, and then the company find it out. So this is something that, you know. Anyway, so those are the symptoms. So what are the neurotransmitter system involved? Actually, neuropeptides, and the one that actually gaining a lot of focus is the endoamine hypothesis, in which that low serotonergic activity. So they have found that the serotonin is important in suicidal behavior, in activity, aggressions, eating disorder, obsessive compulsive behavior, anxiety disorders, and Asian artifact. Facebook is Asian artifact. Wow, that's serious. Personality disorders, seasonal changes, mood disorder, alcohol misuse. So the serotonin actually involved in those. So the reason behind is actually if you change any of those, actually will affect those effects. So in some study, the low CSF 5-HIAA was found in patients with depressions. So as you know that 5-HIAA is the metabolite of serotonin. So if it is low, that means that not enough serotonin is being released. Okay. Now another way to find it actually is the one that actually if you decrease the synthesis, so for example inhibition of the tryptophan hydroxylase, or deplete the tryptophan. So how do you deplete the tryptophan? So you feed the patients with drinks of amino acid. All other amino acid is normal, just to reduce the tryptophan level. Then that can reduce the brain level of tryptophan. And then if you study those patients which has been responsive to selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, then they will have relapse in their depressive syndrome. Okay. Now, just to explain a little bit, so the depression actually is a wide variety of, each individual might have different effects. So some patients are actually responsive to the so-called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Some are less responsive. So that depends. Changes in the serotonin receptor density in patients with depressions. Now, how do they study it? This is actually also not very conclusive. So the reason behind is that if they encounter some people that commit suicide, then that they can, if the family wants to donate their brain samples, then scientists can study those. But it's because of the disorder is not a very uniform pathologically. So every depression patient might be different. So that's the reason why it's very hard to have conclusive effects on that. But in the catecholamine, and catecholamine also related to the depressions apart from the serotonin. For example, if it inhibits the tyrosine hydroxylase, actually that produce some return of depressive syndromes. Some of the metabolite in the CSF also decreased, variated. Less noradrenaline receptors in the postmodern brain studies. So there are a lot of actually dysfunction in the noradrenergic system as well. Okay. In some cases, dopaminergic system has been also implicated, but not as serious as in the serotonergic and noradrenergic, okay, system. So other systems are also believed to be involved, but not as much. Sometimes cholinergic activity, hyperactivity has been shown to be related. Reduced GABAergic activity. So if this reduced GABAergic activity, those patients actually will have more anxiety problem. Okay. The other one is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, HPA, has also have hyperactivity observed in depressive patients. And then the other one, the brain-derived neurotrophic factors, also believed to involve. Actually, the BDNF brain-derived neurotrophic factors actually has been shown that if it is increased, that will actually help for the treatment. So that's the reason why that antidepressants can increase those. Now, as back to the HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, that has been shown to be hyperactive. Now, what happens is that the stress increase the secretion of the cortisol, and then that actually have a long-term effect on the stress responsive system in the brain, and then that believed to contribute to the development of the depression. Now that has been shown in animal actually. So so as I mentioned, the depressive model in the animals is called learned helplessness. So what is learned helplessness?
Getting used to being depressed.
Getting used to helplessness. So it's no help. So one of the example in the animal, it's not a very present one, but it's not going to kill the rodents. So one thing to do it is in the rodents, in which that you get one of the mice or one mouse into a big beaker of water, and the water is deep enough that actually it cannot touch the bottom. So the mouse will, struggle, swim around, trying to get away from the dangerous, So swim all the time. But if there's nothing that after, for example, some time, it still cannot do anything to get help, then it will do the minimum, just move just enough, have the nose just enough over the water. Okay, because the animal just learned that actually there's no way to do anything to overcome the problem. So it's just doing the minimum to just survive. Okay, now if you feed some of those drugs that actually help those patients, for example, SSRI, then actually that can enhance the time to struggle around more before it stops. So that's the reason why that those drugs actually tested to be effective. Compared to schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is actually very difficult to mimic, but depression actually there are models in the animals. So why actually this is a relapse of the case all the time? As you can see that all those system actually there's a metamorphic component. And once that is activated, there will be a long-term alterations of the synaptic plasticity and neuronal morphology. Okay, so they have long-term consequence. That's the reason why that once that the patient develop that, then there will be relapse because that actually the network has changed. They have long consequence then to getting the effects. Okay. So that's the reason why that if people have developed depression, that you try to avoid to have it develop or have that find out the problem as soon as possible or get help as soon as possible. So the treatment of the depressions, so there are different type of the treatment. For example, antidepressant drug. The older one is tricyclic antidepressants. For example, impermin, that's the tricyclic antidepressant. So those are the ones that non-selective inhibitors for monoamine and indoamine. So that actually act on both the noradrenaline and also lesser extent to the serotonin. Now later, that actually the reuptake inhibitors, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors actually developed that called SSRIs. For example, Zoloft or Fluoxetine. That actually have a more specific effect on the serotonin reuptake transporters. So that actually treat a class of those depression patients better. Now, the other one is monoamine inhibitors, monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So those, that actually act on metabolism of both dopamine, adrenaline, and also the serotonin. So that increased overall. Now, other one including electroconvulsive therapy. If you have watched that movie, Beautiful Mind, then there's a scheme actually showing that how they are doing it. So what happens is that in animals, for example, if you electroconvulsives, actually basically shocking with the electricity. So in the animals, or in the rodents, if you shock it with that increase the amount of the brain derived growth factor BDNF. So that believed that to help to treat the depressions. But the problem also actually of that is actually confusion and memory loss for a few days, and so on. Now, another one, actually, we don't know why it is working, is lithium. Actually, lithium also has been prescribed to depressive patients, but actually it is, we don't know how it works, but I mean, that may be a spectrum of maybe the one that not responsive to the SSRI. Now, actually, in a lot of cases, even for treatment of the SSRI, particularly in young people, teenagers, there will be only 50% will be responsive, apart from around from that. And some of those at the beginning of the treatment actually is kind of need to be careful, because that when the patient first take the SSRIs, that may actually have an effect, making them more depressed, because that the system trying to adapt to changes in those levels. Okay. So that's the reason. So there's a video that you can watch in the YouTube in which that talk about, it's an ad that actually has been used for some time, but I don't know, I think that it is not using anymore, but it's a drug company actually promoting the use of the Zoloft, the sertraline, actually, the drugs actually. It is not in Hong Kong, it's in US, because Hong Kong actually, drugs are not allowed to have advertisement. So that you never seen any, you will never see any drug advertisement at TV or newspaper. The one that you have seen, all those are health supplement. Okay. For drugs, actually, is not allowed that. But in US, actually, is allowed. So that's the reason why that actually in US, it's so-called a drug countries, because that people, when they have problems, they will go to take medicine. Okay. Okay. So any questions from online student? Face-to-face student? So just have more students here. So remember to do the assignment. Okay. And then also prepare your project. So you should have done quite a bit of it already. So because next week we are going to have the project presentations. Okay. Any questions from the online student?
The presentation is fully through Zoom, or is mixed up more like normal lecture?
I think I have to through. I'll talk about the timeline. So which group on which day depends on how the time management. So although we have like 15 minutes, 10 minutes presentation, how many minutes? 10 minutes presentation and 5 minutes Q&A. But sometimes that student will overrun, and also depends on how fast that they can prepare. So let's do an estimation on Wednesday. Okay.
Is there any penalty if you overrun the time?
Huh?
Is there any penalty if you overrun the time?
I try not to penalize the student, but I cannot just cut you off, and but try to be on time. But if it is too long, you will not get a better score. Let's say it this way.
But you will get worse score, right?
It depends. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Maybe 1 to 2 minutes will be fine, but not like 10-minute presentation become like half an hour.
Yes, exactly. So 1 to 2 minutes will be okay, but if too much, then that will be okay. So if no questions, then see you on Wednesday. Okay. Okay. Goodbye.